Good evening, guys. Rainy, humid. I've got another viewer account. I want to read to you guys another fantastic story sent to me this week. Let's get right at it. Thunderstorm just finished, so we might have another one coming through. Bigfooter Gary, I love the channel and all the work you do. I think the Bigfoot breakdowns will be fun, and I really enjoy hearing other accounts of Bigfoot. I know it's real. I saw one and had a terrifying encounter. I want to share a hunting experience I had as a young man many years ago in the woods of Montana. I can't be specific with the location because let's just say we had a hunt camp in an area where there really shouldn't be a camp. It wasn't much of a camp, just a place to get out of the weather with an old set of bunk beds and a makeshift table and a few cans of supplies. Oh, I guess we can't forget the Girly magazines. What can I say? We were young, and even though I call this a hunting incident, the little hidden camp was used by a few of us as a home base for fishing expeditions, camping, hunting, and hell, just getting away from the parents. I lived close to a reserve growing up, and a lot of my friends were native. I myself have mixed blood. I look native, but my mom is white. So back in the day, I fit right in on the reserve, and nobody ever gave me a second look. Most folks want off the reserve, but I loved it there. My two best friends grew up there, and I spent every hour after school and weekends out in the woods with those guys. I learned to hunt, trap, track, fish, and more on that reserve. Many years later, I found out that one of the elders who took us under his wing was actually my grandfather. I never knew it at the time, and it wouldn't change anything. He treated all of the younger generation with respect, and we returned it the same. He taught us much about living off the land, and we all became pretty self-sufficient at an early age. Back to our cabin in the woods. I don't know why we ended up building it where we did. I think we had just found some old hunting blinds nearby and bits and pieces from a long fallen down camp. At the time, we thought we were still on reserve property, and we built this thing without a second thought. We later came to find out we were on state land. Not that it really mattered. The white folks thought it was reserved there, and the native folks all knew us. But it's still better to keep some things to myself. The area was rugged. We were a couple of miles down a back road and then another 500 yards up an old fishing trail. We had built the camp down in a low gully so it would be hard to find. Okay, I say camp, but let's face it, it was really a fort. A pretty good one, but it wasn't going to win any Architecture of the Year awards. We figured if anybody found it and burned us out, it wouldn't be a big loss. But after a few years, it kind of became our getaway. As I say, we had scavenged an old camp, and our little fort had one small window and a door and an old set of bunks which we had pulled from under the walls of the camp. We had fixed the frame up as good as new. We only had one mattress on the bottom bunk and a board to sleep on the top. It was still the best getaway you could want, and it was ours. I will use the names of my grandfather's people to identify us in this account. I am Machk. My best friends were Suki and Kitchi. The three of us spent a lot of time at our home in the woods. Maybe times were different back then, but I don't ever remember having to explain to my mom where I was going, other than to tell her I was sleeping at Suki or Kitchi's, and we would tell their mom they were going to sleep at my house. Nobody ever questioned it. We would always stop by my grandfather's and make our presence known. He knew we had a hideout in the woods, we just never told him where exactly. It was fall, and me and the other boys had decided that this year we wanted to try our luck deer hunting with traditional bows. Our camp was surrounded by 3 creeks, which were within an hour's walk, and the woods were thick and full of game. Not only had we seen lots of deer in these woods, but black bear, fox, and other small game as well. Most of our time in these woods had been spent fishing. The local creeks all had brook trout, whitefish, and rainbows. And as I say, we were quite familiar with a large tract of land, not only around our camp, but up the creek as well, quite a ways from the reserve. If you want to get out a quarter mile from the lowland creeks, you're going to hit open fields. But we didn't want to hunt those fields with our bows, as deer instinctively stayed away from the edge of the woods, as many hunters used guns there, and the deer knew better. Suki and Kitchi and I were going to hunt the thick woods by traditional methods, and the hope was we would get one and impress my grandfather and some of the other elders. You know, show them we were learning and we could still do things the traditional way. We scoured the creek beds for almost a full day looking for deer sign and a couple of good spots to set up blinds. Kitchi actually had a tree seat that he had borrowed from his older brother. Note the borrowed is in quotations. It was very easy to find a good spot for Kitchi with that seat. We set him up about 300 yards outside of camp on a nice little rock outcropping overlooking a bend in the river. There was a nice deer trail running right beside the creek there. We didn't set the seat too high as we had no ladder, but there was a nice log we propped up against the tree so he could get in and out of the seat. I would say it was 8 feet off the ground, and being on the rock outcropping, it was another 4 feet above the creek. So, close to 12 feet off the creek bed. Myself and Suki both would have to make do with ground blinds, so we built one to the east for Suki, probably 500 yards from camp, and a second one to the west of Kitchi's tree seat that would be my blind. It was a couple hundred yards from Kitchi and still a couple hundred yards out from our camp. It took the better part of the first afternoon to get all 3 blinds set up to our liking. We were all in our mid-teens then and still pretty new to hunting. We had been taught enough to know how to do it, we just didn't have a lot of experience actually putting the knowledge into field practice. We were gung-ho though, and if you asked any of us, we would have told you without a doubt we were going to shoot a deer in the next day or two by traditional bow. We were that sure of ourselves. That afternoon, Kitchi had to return to the reserve. He had to help his mom by watching his little sister. His mom was going to a bingo or something, so he was not allowed to camp out that first night. Suki and I were going to stay in the camp. We had brought some canned goods and a jar of peanut butter and bread. We liked to get water from the creek to boil, and we had brought tea to drink. We didn't think of it as roughing it. Hell, we ate better here than at home, sometimes especially when the fish were biting. And it just so happened that when Kitchi left, we went down to the river and caught a nice rainbow for dinner. Suki cooked the fish and I helped him make tea, and we ate peanut butter and trout for dinner. I still smile thinking how we felt like forest kings. We didn't need money or jobs. We had everything we needed right there at that little camp. We sat around the fire until dark and then decided to go inside. We didn't have any lantern in the camp, but we did have a half dozen candles. We also had one old flashlight that needed new batteries, but every time we came back to camp, we would remember after the fact that we had not brought any. So it still worked, but not very well. Good enough to go out and do your business in the middle of the night, but you couldn't see more than 10 feet with it. In the camp, we rock, paper, scissored for who got which bunk. I lost, and Suki got the mattress. We both had summer sleeping bags, and I really didn't mind sleeping on the top bunk. We had put the window at the end of the bunks, and I could see outside from my sleeping bag. I actually liked being able to see outside. Across from the bunks, the camp door also had a small window in the top of it. Those 2 little windows were the only light inside the camp. We had a deck of cards there and an old radio. I can't remember if it had batteries that night, but usually it played more static than music anyway. We played cards for a bit and Suki lost and got mad. As he always did, he turned to his dirty magazines for entertainment. I had read them all and was pretty bored, so I decided we should go to sleep as Kitchi was supposed to be back early the next morning to start the hunt. I went to bed and Suki followed shortly after. Something woke us up in the middle of the night as it knocked the frying pan off the stump beside the fire outside. We both listened in the dark for a bit, but didn't hear anything else. Suki had not cleaned the pan, and the smell had no doubt drawn some critter into camp. After hearing nothing else, we both fell back asleep. That first night was otherwise uneventful for us, anyway. I can't say the same thing for back on the reserve. Of course, we didn't know that until the next morning, as we got up and made toast and a batch of tang. Boiled river water and tang. Oh yeah, that brings me back. Kitchi showed up with more supplies on his brother's bike, which he had borrowed. Yes, more quotations, and he was all excited. He said there had been talk at the store that morning by a bunch of the locals at the coffee shop, and that there had been some kind of bear attack or something the night before. Not really an attack, but that one of the families had said that a bear had tried to break into the house and was banging on their trailer, and that it had ripped the clothesline right off its pulley. The porch steps had been broken, and the trailer was rocked back and forth. Kitschy had stopped to listen, but only briefly. He said the family, whose name I won't mention, was very upset and that the reserve police had been called and a large bear was seen. Well, the reserve police said they saw a bear, but the family was insisting they were not sure. A public safety warning was being issued and everyone was asked to be careful and on the lookout. We didn't have a gun at our little camp, but we each had a bow and plenty of arrows. And as kids, we were not afraid of any bear. If it came close enough, we would simply shoot it. We were hoping to shoot a deer, as many of the hunters bragged of their skill in tracking or waiting out deer. Bear, as everyone knew, could be lured in with garbage or any smell in a barrel, and we didn't see the skill in that. We put our fire out, made a quick plan amongst ourselves to return to camp for lunch and do an afternoon hunt if we were not successful in the morning. I left the other boys and made my way to my blind. I was actually set up across the creek on a nice high ridge looking down at the creek, and the deer trail was below me. I was using a pine for ground cover, and we had stuck a bunch of other branches in the mix to hide my spot. Hours passed and I didn't see or hear anything. All of a sudden from behind me I heard a loud crack and something walking. It didn't sound like a deer, not the light feet of a whitetail. I was pretty sure it was a bear. I even heard a low huff of breath. I tensed up. Suddenly, not as sure of my prowess with a bow now that I was actually confronted with a live bear. I hadn't seen it, but I was pretty sure I was hearing it, and it sounded heavy. I didn't move a muscle. It was behind me, and I was afraid if I turned to look, I would scare it off. I was still trying to decide if I wanted to shoot it or not. The sounds faded, and whatever it was moved off. I didn't have to make that decision to shoot or not. Lunchtime came, and I returned to the camp empty-handed. As it happened, so did Kitchi and Suki. Suki had seen nothing and had had an uneventful morning. Kitchi, though, was a little rattled and repeated a tale almost the same as what I had experienced. He said something had been circling him all morning. He was a little confused as he could see quite well from his tree seat, but had not been able to find the animal walking the forest with him. He said it made him uneasy and reminded us of the bear attack from the night before. I could tell he was letting his nerves get to him. After an hour back at camp, though, and of course the cockiness that comes from outdoing one's friends, Kitchi was no longer upset. He was telling us how he would shoot that bear if he saw it, and that would be that. Of course he was in a tree, and it would be easier for him to get away with that. Make a bad shot, and a bear still has to climb a tree to get you. I thought about it and decided I wouldn't shoot the bear if I saw it. Back in my blind that afternoon, time dragged on. Nothing was moving, and it was really warm for that time of year. I was having a hard time staying focused. We had agreed to meet back at camp just before dark. That was when the deer liked to move, and we wanted to be successful. As the forest started to darken, though, I could feel an uneasiness come over me. I really hadn't thought of it, but I was usually with friends in the woods. Being out here alone with the quiet, it was unnerving. I stayed as long as I could in my blind and then decided to return to camp. In my head, I made the excuse of getting supper ready for the other guys, but really, I was on edge. I returned to camp and made a fire. I got water from the creek and was just warming the frying pan to cook eggs when I heard the yell. I wasn't sure who was yelling. I thought maybe Kitchi, but wasn't sure. I couldn't hear the words, but a second scream came from the direction of Kitchi's blind and I froze. I didn't know what to do. Was it the bear? Was he calling for help? I grabbed my bow and I took a few steps into the woods. It was dark enough now that leaving the fire made the woods seem even darker. I got a hold of myself and started towards Kitchi's tree seat. I hadn't gone 100 yards when I heard running. My heart pounded in my chest. Brush was breaking and something was running straight at me. All of a sudden, Suki burst out of the leaves, slamming into me. He fell to the ground. His eyes were wide and he was trembling. His hands were empty and he was dirty. He picked himself up, he looked at me and turned to point back to Kitchi's blind. Something got Kitchi, he whispered. He's not in his blind. Suki went on to tell me how he was actually on his way back to camp when he heard Kitchi scream and there was something crashing in the bush. Suki had stopped and made his bow ready, but had seen nothing coming down the deer trail. As he began to move back towards Kitchi's blind, he said he heard the loud crack of what must have been Kitchi's bones as he screamed again. He was sure something had gotten him, as the forest had gone silent after that. Slowly and in terror, Suki made his way to the rock outcropping from a distance. He had seen the log we had set up for Kitchi to get in the seat broken at the base of the tree, and no Kitchi. He also said he was sure Kitchi's bow was there on the rocks. It was then that he heard running on the far side of the creek. Suki had turned in terror and run, his bow catching on a tree. The string tangled in a branch. He had simply let go of it as he could not pull it free fast enough. Panic makes people do stupid things, and I always thought that was pretty stupid, but that is what happened. It was shortly after that Suki had run into me on the trail. So there we stood alone in the dark woods with one bow between us, our friend missing, in the dark, alone and scared. Before I could stop myself, I called out for Kitschy, and the look on Suki's face startled me. He grabbed me so fast around the head, covering my mouth. He was shaking and he hissed in my ear to be quiet. I'd never seen him so terrified. We stood there, both of us, shaking for a long time listening, hoping Kitschy would answer or come down the deer trail. He never did. At some point we decided it was too dark to look for him without a light. I told Suki I was going for the flashlight and that we would return to Kitschy's blind and find him. I don't think Suki liked this plan, but he followed me back to camp. At camp I threw all of our remaining firewood on the fire. That would help us light the camp and we would be able to see if Kitschy needed any first aid. I entered the camp to get the flashlight, Suki right behind me. I got the light and turned for the door. Suki stood at the table looking at me but not following. He looked me right in the eye and told me he wasn't going back out there again. We began to argue. I couldn't believe what he was saying. Our friend was in trouble. I was not understanding what he was thinking was going to happen if we didn't go help Kitschy. We never finished the argument as something smashed into the back wall of the camp. The whole place shook and both of us dropped low to the ground in terror. The walls were made of plywood and were not very thick. Hell, we hadn't even used more than 3 or 4 2x4s on each wall. From outside we could hear heavy breathing and something was lifting the tin at the back corner of the camp. A screeching sound filled the camp as the nails on the tin roof were pulled out of place. Suki dove under the bottom bunk, actually hiding under his sleeping bag. I had moved instinctively to the door, trying to see out the teeny little 4-inch window. The only thing I could see was the campfire, which was going really good at this point, and about 6 feet of woods that were lit up by the fire. I stood there looking and shaking, and what I saw next still filled me with terror. At first, I thought it was the bear. It was there at the edge of the woods. I could see fur glistening in the firelight. It had its back to me. I whispered to Suki one word, bear. My eyes never left the bear as it was low to the ground. I figured it was licking the grease out of the frying pan. I actually thought, now is my chance. I need to shoot this thing before it breaks into the camp. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have time to even get the door open when it stood up and turned to face the camp. When I say stood up, I mean on 2 legs. Long fur hanging down, each arm hanging at its side. When it turned to look back at the camp, I saw a face. A human face. That thing was no bear. It was a wild man. No clothes, covered in fur, intelligent eyes, and the size. It was huge. I don't remember this happening, but Suki says I let out a scream that was so loud he covered his ears. I do remember this thing looking surprised all of a sudden, as it very slowly and stealthily stepped back out of the firelight and into the darkness of the forest. I just about collapsed right there. I had no words for what I had seen, and I could not speak. I pushed the table over in front of the door and went and sat on the bottom bunk with Suki, awaiting what I was certain was death. Fuck. This thing had already killed Kitschy, and we were next. A long time passed. We sat in the dark, too afraid to light a candle or even move. We hardly breathed as we tried to hide. Hours passed. I was not going back for Kitschy. I was sure I wouldn't live to see the morning. At some point, the darkness around us was split by a beam of light, and the front door to the camp rattled. A voice loudly commanded us to open the door and asked who was in there. At first we were confused, but I recognized my grandfather's voice. There were more voices outside. Suki literally started crying right there. We opened the door and there was my grandfather and one of the reservation police officers, and behind him, Kitschy. I believe it was at this point that I started crying. Grandfather told us to leave our stuff and that we were leaving. Shaking the whole way we walked out the fishing trail with every hair on my body standing at attention. I didn't care that the officer had a gun or that they had really good flashlights. I told my grandfather immediately what I had seen and that it was not a bear. The officer beside him looked doubtful, but he didn't say a word. He just told us that we had to move now and that his cruiser was parked back at the trailhead. We had a good half-hour walk in the dark back to the safety of the vehicle. Suki and I later came to find out what had happened to Kitschy that night, and I can't say it was any less terrifying. He said he was in the tree seat and feeling uneasy as he had been all day. As it had gotten dark, he had heard the footsteps, the same as earlier, and yet he could not see any animal. Finally, as darkness thickened, he said he had seen the bear coming low out of the grass at the edge of the creek on all fours. It peered through a down tree and the tall grass. Kitschy decided he was going to shoot the bear as he could see its shoulder and he knew where the lungs were. He drew and shot, and then everything changed in an instant. The arrow hit a branch or got tangled in the tall grass. It missed its mark. The bear thrashed in the brush, maybe wounded. It was growling and frothing, and then all of a sudden it stood up and charged Kitschy. That was when Kitschy screamed. It was no bear running at him. It was huge and angry and red. He said it grabbed the log we had leaned against the tree for Kitschy to get into a seat and swung it into the tree, snapping it in two. The creature had roared at Kitschy and ran up the trail towards Suki's blind. Kitschy had made the decision to jump out of the tree seat when it took off. He hit the ground hard, and that was when he screamed for the second time, as his wrist was jammed into the rocks when he landed. Kitschy wasted no time and was up and running down the creek. He said he was sure the thing was chasing him, and he ran off down the deer trail towards the reserve for help. There were no more sightings of the creature in our area at that time. 2 reports were made to the reservation authorities, and for a while Kitschy, Suki, and I were asked to tell what happened to us a few times. I find it funny to hear how people do not like to talk about wild man or Sasquatch for fear of looking stupid or not being believed, but on the reserve it is almost for sure known that he is real and exists. I have to admit, in my younger years I never really thought about it, but now many years later I know what I saw and that it really is real. The elders of the tribe do not record fantasy, only truth. Truth is what helps the tribe survive. And I tell you this, Gary, Sasquatch is real. I saw it with my own eyes. So did my friend Kitschy, as well as another family the night before our sighting on the reserve. Thank you for allowing me to share our encounter. Best of luck in your search. Machk in Montana. So I apologize to Machk if I pronounced those names wrong. I did my best. I also want you guys to note there's a reason why I'm doing them this time of day, the evening. You know, it's 8 o'clock right now and not in the dark when some of you have requested. Because, as you'll notice, there are no mosquitoes around me right now. If I wait another hour, then we have our swarm of mosquitoes, which just make doing this a lot more difficult. So, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you appreciate and enjoyed the story. I want to thank Machk in Montana. M-A-C-H-K, Machk. Is that right? Let me know. Let me know in the comments, guys, if I completely butchered those. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next week in the next adventure.